we've already created the Ajax object, and the only thing we did with the Ajax object is retrieve the data from an XML. Now this is pure JavaScript. Now there's no Ajax here. Why? Because what we're doing now in the store XML, when we say XML equals response XML, request.response, this is where the Ajax comes in. But now we've copied everything and stored it into a variable called XML. Now we create a new function, populate cells, which will go ahead and populate the cell. Now remember, when we go back and look at our XML file, it's just a list of num, 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 num. So here is where I start a variable called I, and I say nums equals XML dot get element by tag name, not ID, because this is a tag called num. So now nums becomes an array with everywhere this tag is. And then I go for I equals 0, I less than nums dot length, I plus plus, document dot get element by ID, NI. Because that, remember, we labeled our column names N0, N1, N2, N3, N4. So that's why N0 would be, so when this loops goes in, it goes, you say document.get element by ID, NI. I is the number, so it'll be N0 dot inner HTML equals nums of I dot first child dot data. So that first child dot data lets you pick up the value. So this is where, when this loop runs, the entire table gets populated, except for the total. Except for the total. See, in your examples, if you right now go ahead and mark out the total, so the totalized function, so right now by running nums of I dot first child dot data. What is first child? Because remember, an array in an XML document, remember this is the root element and the child object, so that's the first child dot data. So now what happens is it goes through the array. So by running this line, each of these values are automatically populated, but not the total. Not the total. For the total, we have to now go ahead and create a new function that will now take each of these values and makes a total. And again, for that you'll have to have one function that totals all the columns here and one that totals all the rows here. So that's why right after we've populated the cell, we now call a new function called totalize, in which we are going to actually add the total. And each time I'm going to start scrolling up. So now I go up on top, and here is my function which basically goes in and totalizes. So now, again, in totalize, remember, you want to create a total of all the columns and a total of all the sums. So how does he totalize that? Okay. You start with this one. This is row number 1, but column number 0. Correct? Because N0 and R1 in our ID. So he starts with a variable called I, a sum, which he initializes by 0, a row number equals 1, and a column number equals 0. Now this is where programming comes in. Initially, when you guys get to employment, your boss is going to tell you, Marino, I want you to write a JavaScript code that takes these numbers and adds it up and totalizes it. You don't know what the rest of the application is doing. You just know that, okay, this is where you need to do. So that's why I break each one down. So how do you do it? You say, okay, in your HTML file, remember you give an ID to each column. N0, N1, N2, N3, N4, N5. And you gave an ID to each row also, row R1, R2, R3. But actually we didn't give R1, R2, R3, we just gave N0, N1, N2, N3, N4, N5. So here I say, again, variable I, sum equals 0, row number equals 1, and column number equals 0. Then I say nums dot equals XML dot get element by tag name num. Now again I start with for I equals 0, I less than nums dot length I plus plus. Now then I want to add. Then what I want to do is I want to add each of the sums. So here what I'll do is I'll say sum plus equals, and because these values can come in strings, I want to make sure they don't come in a string. I'm going to use a function called parse float. Parse float will take a value and return an integer. So you're absolutely sure. So my question to you is, how do you read that value from the XML file? Well, very simple. The value from the XML file is always read. So if you have the first value as 0, you're always going to use the XML. Yeah, you always start with XML dot get element by tag nums, and that by tag num. This has now created num an array. Now to read that array, all you have to do is now say num of 0 dot first child, the property, dot data. Remember how we were reading form yesterday by saying form dot, whatever your form name was, dot field name, dot value, and it would read that value. This would read from the XML document. First child, dot data. So these are child objects. Yeah? So as num goes down, it reads that. So basically, by putting it in a for loop, your I is going to change. That's what he does here. He says, so when you say, so what we do here, when we say sum plus equals, and put this in a parse float, what it does is it retrieves each value now as an integer and adds it to sum. You see that? So what does the value of sum become? The addition of then he goes further down. Now how do you know? Now he wants to make sure that he has to enter this in this cell. So here he says he wants it to stop by saying if I plus 1, because I starts from 0, okay? And the length is 0, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but 0 through 4, to go to 5th is 0 through 4. So nums dot length will be 5. So he says if I plus 1, so when I starts at 0 and goes to 4, at 5th we want it to stop. So he says if I plus 1 mod 5 equals 0, because if I is 4, 4 plus 1 is 5. So 5 divided by 5 will be 0, because this is the 5th. When I reaches here, it will be 5. So that's why he says, when I divided by mod 5 equals 0, document.get element by ID RT plus row number dot inner HTML equals sum. So there he puts sum. But sometimes the value could be 5 or 5.00. So notice here I'm calling another function called formatted sum. But we'll come to formatted in a moment. You could just say equals sum. And then it resets the sum again to become 0 and increments the row number again. So now you move to the next one. Again you go from nums of 0 to number 4, when nums turn 5, the total gets added. Again it goes in. So this is how he has added the total at the end of each one. See that? Because if I say because he has to add the total after the 4th column. You see that? If you look at this very first, this for loop, this part, just this part, where I go in and say nums equals xml.getElement by tag name, for I equals 0, I is nums.length. In your XML document, how many nums are there? There are 3 rows, 15. Remember? So this will start reading and adding to the sum of all the total. This would be good for grand total, but not for just the first row. So how do I stop it after 5? Well, with the if statement. Now you see why the if statement comes in? Because now I'm saying if num of 0, if that the moment nums of I becomes 5, stop it. Now I could have said if I equals 5, then just go ahead and put sum there. But he makes it more scalable by saying if I plus 1 mod 5 equals 0, then go ahead and populate sum in that get element by ID RT. And row number by this time is 1. Then below that he increments row number to be row number plus plus. So now when it goes back, row number becomes 2. Again the same thing starts over, and row number because his for loop is technically finishing right here. So now you see my for loop starts with I equals 0. So it only goes 1 row at a time, and each time it puts so row number I started with 1, so first it will put the total here, then row number 2, then row number 3. And once the row number 3 stops, and I will reach the num.length. Why don't I put a stop to row number? Nothing. Now the same thing for column. Now we want to put the column total over here. So for column, remember where did we start the column number to? 0. So for column total, you have to go again with a new I loop, with the new for loop. And first, here's how he populates. Now he's populating this guy. I'm explaining all this, but I also understand that for the first time, all this can be a little bit overwhelming. But what you focus right now is understanding what he's doing. So that when you go back and try to practice and create this, it is definitely going to be a good help. But once again, I want all of you to know that as a privilege to the students of ABCO Technology, one of the things that I do is even after class, when you're actually going to sit down and say, okay, let me create this application. Don't create it like a typist, create it like a code, the way I'm going with the flow. And if you still say, well, I'm trying my best, I don't understand, call me or email me, and we can set up a time one-on-one when I can explain just that piece to you. And you can email me, sometimes we could just do it over the phone. But you have that privilege. So now, moving forward, the same thing is being applied for the column. So here I go, while column number is not equal to 5. Why? Because column number starts at 0, so it has to go through 4. So while it's not less than 5, again, the same thing. I start with for I equals 0. Here, I start right away by saying if I mod 5 equals 0, sum. This time, I take I plus column number dot first child dot data. So now, because I said the column number, it's going down rather than horizontal. It's going vertical. And once I get that, I place that in the CT. Remember, we labeled this cell. You see now, when you create HTML with JavaScript, ID is very important because ID is like a ID tag that you give to that. So that when you want to populate that cell, all you have to do is say document.getElement by ID CT, and column number is CT1, CT2, CT3, CT4, CT5, and then equals sum. Again, you reset sum 0 and increment column number by 1. So you go with, but here he also has a second for loop. For the grand total. Because after all 4 of these comes, now we put the grand total. Remember, I told you in the grand total we don't need to say if I equals 0. So for even the grand total cell we put GT. For grand total, all it does is we go from I equals less than 0, I nums of length, sum equals plus for nums of I dot first child dot data. So starting in the XML document, it will take all the num added up, and I say put that in the GT column. But you notice that every time I put that in each cell, so I go in and you call another function called formatted. What is that formatted function? Well, equals sum is fine, but later, I'll explain to you in a moment what that formatted is. But before we do that, I want to make sure that here, so here now, we have actually gone ahead and added the totals. So at this point, your cell is done, and at this point, your function is formatted.
Probably the core.
All right.